Today, I want to share with you a story that begins on one of those winter mornings when the world feels half frozen and half alive, and fate waits just beyond the fence line. December dawn had barely broken over Silver Butte Valley. The sky hung low, the color of hammered iron, and the cold pressed against the cabin walls like something living and impatient. Inside, Marion Cooper was tending to the small stove, coaxing heat into the kind of morning that made breath turn white and bones ache. That was when the cabin door slammed open. Her 12-year-old son, Eli, stood there, cheeks flushed, breath ripping out of him in clouds. He wasn't frightened often. Marion had raised him to be steady, the way his father once was. But on that morning, something in the boy's eyes cut straight through her. "Ma," he gasped. "There's blood by the ridge. Fresh. And tracks, big ones." For a second, everything stilled except the wind. Marion set the coffee pot aside and reached for the rifle hanging above the mantel. She'd been a widow for nearly 4 years, but the instinct to protect her home had only sharpened. She wrapped a scarf around her neck, grabbed her coat, and nodded toward the door. "Show me." Outside, the air bit hard enough to make her eyes water. Snow stretched in every direction, endless and unforgiving. But the sign Eli had spotted wasn't subtle. Dark drops dotted the white ground like ink spilled on linen. They followed it together, Marion on horseback, Eli close beside her, moving through a silence so deep it swallowed every sound except the creak of saddle leather and the crunch of hooves. The trail grew heavier near the far fence line, almost smeared. Something had been dragged, or someone. Eli pointed ahead, his mittened hand trembling despite the cold discipline Marion knew he tried to show. "There, Ma." At first she saw only snowdrift. Then the shape inside it shifted slightly, and her heart kicked hard. A man lay crumpled against a fence post. His coat was torn, his boots worn nearly through. Frost clung to his hair like white ash, and his lips were the color of bruised blueberries. He looked more ghost than living soul, and he wasn't alone. 3 wolves paced in a wide circle around him, gray shadows moving with measured patience, waiting for life to fade just enough to finish what hunger had started. Marion's grip tightened on the rifle. She nudged her horse forward, raised the barrel, and fired a single shot into the air. The sound cracked through the valley like thunder off canyon walls. The wolves scattered at once, their shapes dissolving into the line of timber. Only then did Marion dismount. The cold attacked her legs as she stepped into the deep snow and knelt beside the stranger. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, faint pulse, fading, but still there. His breath rattled against the winter air in thin, shallow threads. He was early 40s, rugged in the way men became when life had turned hard and stayed that way. Frostbite gnawed at his fingers. His jaw was tightened in unconscious pain. Whoever he was, he hadn't come to this place by accident, and he hadn't fallen by chance. Eli's voice wavered behind her. "Should we leave him?" "Ma." Marion closed her eyes for a moment, long enough to remember her husband, how his horse came home without him, and how she'd found him days later, frozen and alone, the world already moving on without him. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. "No," she said softly. "No one dies alone on my land. Not today." She slid her arms beneath the stranger's shoulders. His skin was stone cold, his weight heavy with surrender. But Marion Cooper had never been one to let fate decide everything. "Help me lift him," she told Eli. And together, mother and son hauled a dying man out of death's path. unaware that saving him would change all their lives before the winter was through. Marian Cooper had carried wounded men before her late husband, her aging father, even neighbors who'd been kicked by a horse or cut by a saw. But never had she hauled a half-frozen stranger across a winter valley with wolves still watching from the timberline. By the time she and Eli reached the cabin, her arms trembled with exhaustion. Not fear, she didn't let herself feel that, but the weight of the unknown pressed on her all the same. The moment they pushed open the door, the warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like an old quilt. Little Rosie, only 7, looked up from the table where she'd been stitching buttons onto a rag doll made of scrap cloth. Her eyes widened when she saw the man slumped between Marian and Eli. "Ma, who's that? Help me gather blankets." Marian answered, her voice gentle but firm. "Hurry." "Rosie, girl." Rosie scrambled from her chair, her small feet thumping across the wooden floor as she pulled blankets from the cedar chest. Eli helped lower the stranger near the fire, where the hearth glowed deep orange, the color of safety and life. Marian knelt beside him, pulling the blankets over his frozen body. Up close, the man looked worse than she'd realized. Frostbite had chewed at the tips of his fingers. His cheeks were raw and windburned, his breaths shallow and uneven. Sweat glistened on his forehead even though his skin felt cold as river ice. "Ma, look." Eli pointed. The stranger's lips moved. Barely. A sound escaped him, broken, unfinished, like the tail end of a dream grinding into a nightmare. "Shouldn't have come back." His voice rasped like gravel. "They'll find me." Marian froze for half a heartbeat. Only half. Because fear might rise in her chest. But she never let it rule her. Someone was looking for this man. And whoever they were, he feared them more than wolves. Rosie moved closer, clutching her doll to her chest. "Ma, what's he saying? Who's gonna find him? Nothing for you to worry about," Marian murmured, though her own heart had begun to beat harder. She dipped a cloth in cool water and laid it across the man's burning forehead. Fever and frostbite together were a cruel mix, death pulling from two sides at once. Eli knelt opposite her, studying the man with wide, fascinated eyes. "Do you think he's bad?" "Ma, doesn't matter what he is," she said. "What matters is he's dying." Rosie's lip trembled. "Why'd the wolves want him?" "Because he was alone," Marian said quietly. "Out here, being alone gets you killed faster than any animal." For a moment, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the stranger's uneven breathing. Outside, a fresh gust of wind rattled the shutters, as if winter itself pressed its ear to the cabin door to hear what was happening inside. Marian dipped the cloth again, wiped the man's temples, checked the pulse at his neck. Weak, but still there. Eli watched every movement, hungry to understand, to learn, to help, and Rosie hovered behind him, peeking over his shoulder as though expecting the man to spring to life at any moment. Marian couldn't help it. She remembered finding her husband, 3 days cold in a ravine, alone, forgotten, and already halfway claimed by the earth. She'd sworn afterward that if she ever came across another soul in need, friend, enemy, stranger, she would not let the frontier swallow them the way it had swallowed him. She pressed the cloth firmly against the stranger's fevered skin, grounding herself in the promise she had kept tucked away in her heart for years. "No man dies alone out here," she said softly. "Not on my land, not while I'm breathing." Rosie stepped closer, braver now. "Ma, Is he going to wake up? In time. Marion said, If he wants to live. Eli nodded, studying the stranger's swollen knuckles and scarred hands. He looks like he's been through a lot. Marion hesitated, letting her gaze travel across the man's battered features, his jawline shadowed with days of suffering. His brow creased even in unconsciousness. His shoulders shaped by hard labor and harder roads. Yes, she whispered. He has. They sat around him for a while, Marion tending to him, Eli asking questions, Rosie clutching her doll as though it could offer answers. The fire glowed brighter, warming the man's frozen limbs. Outside, the valley lay silent beneath its blanket of ice and wind. In that quiet, Marion felt something shift. The arrival of this stranger wasn't an accident. Winter often brought storms, broken fences, and hungry wolves. But sometimes, it carried a man to your door for reasons you wouldn't understand until much later. And on that cold morning, with danger whispering just beyond the ridge and a fevered drifter lying beside her hearth, Marion Cooper unknowingly opened the first page of a story that would change all their lives, hers, her children's, and perhaps even the stranger's before the winter was done. For 3 days, the stranger drifted somewhere between this world and the next. Fever shook him like a storm shakes an old barn door, fierce, unrelenting, determined to take him. Marion rarely left his side except to tend chores or rest her eyes for an hour at a time. And even then, Eli or Rosie kept watch, whispering to each other as if the man might wake at any moment. On the morning of the 3rd day, as a pale sliver of sunlight crept through the frost-rimmed window, the stranger finally stirred. Not the restless movements of fever, but a steady blink, slow, deliberate, purposeful. Marion noticed first. She turned from the stove just in time to see his hand twitch against the blanket. His eyes opened fully, unfocused at first, then sharpening just enough to show a glimmer of awareness. He swallowed hard, his voice rough as winter gravel. Where am I? In my home? Marion replied. And alive. Which is more than you were when we found you. The man tried to push himself upright and immediately winced, collapsing back into the chair near the hearth. His breath came short and strained. Don't try that again, Marion warned. You're still half broken. He gave a weak, humorless chuckle. Feels more like 3/4. Rosie scrambled from her chair, her small feet thumping across the wooden floor as she pulled blankets from the cedar chest. Eli helped lower the stranger near the fire, where the hearth glowed deep orange, the color of safety and life. Marion knelt beside him, pulling the blankets over his frozen body. Rosie peeked from behind the table and gave a timid nod. The man's eyes softened. Then I owe all of you more than I can pay. Marion approached, the steady confidence of someone used to handling crisis etched in her movements. Start with your name. I don't like having strangers under my roof. He hesitated, as though debating whether the truth was safe. Then, Jonas Hale. Marion repeated it under her breath. Testing it, weighing it. Names mattered on the frontier. A man's name could carry a reputation clean or stained. And Jonas Hale spoke his like someone who expected it to matter again someday. What were you doing out near my ridge? She asked. Jonas let out a tired sigh. Trying to stay ahead of a storm, didn't outrun it. It wasn't the full truth. She could hear it, see it, feel it in the way his gaze drifted, not with shame, but caution. He looked around the cabin then, taking in the carved wooden table, the patchwork quilts, the children's boots lined neatly near the door. His eyes lingered on Rosie's crooked little doll sitting beside the fire. A home. A real one. The kind a man could spend a lifetime hoping for. "How long was I out?" he asked. "3 days." Marion answered. Jonas scrubbed a hand across his face, wincing as his joints protested. "I shouldn't stay. I'm taking up space. Food? Time? You're too weak to walk 10 steps, let alone ride out." Marion cut in. "You'll stay until you can stand upright without toppling over." There was no softness in her voice, but no coldness either, just the unyielding practicality of a frontier widow who had survived enough winters to know that pride didn't keep anyone alive. Jonas didn't argue further. He simply nodded slow, grateful, accepting what felt strangely like mercy. As the afternoon light shifted, Jonas studied the room more closely. That's when he saw it, a small ledger resting on the corner of Marion's desk. The edges were frayed. Pages creased from being opened too often. Numbers filled every line, ink worn to near transparency in places. But the words scribbled beside them: late, due, final notice. Jonas knew that kind of weight. It was the weight that pulled a man down even when his legs still worked. The same weight that had taken his ranch years before. Marion noticed his gaze and moved to close the ledger with a quiet, decisive thump. "Don't concern yourself with that," she said. He met her eyes steady, dark, searching. "Debts." Marion didn't answer at first. Then she exhaled through her nose in the tired way only a woman carrying more responsibility than rest can. "Everyone owes something out here," she said. "Some owe money. Others owe mistakes. Either way, the winter doesn't care." Jonas nodded slightly. He understood more than she realized. Too much. Maybe. Something like unease flickered across Marion's face. Not because of him, but because she sensed the same truth he did. If the town learned she'd taken in a man, judgment would come faster than any snowstorm. And yet she had done it anyway. "Rest," Marion said, pulling the blanket higher around his shoulders. "When you're strong enough to walk, you and I will talk again." Jonas leaned back, staring into the hearth where flames danced in quiet rhythms. The warmth seeped into his bones. Thawing parts of him he'd forgotten were frozen long before the snow ever touched him. For the first time in a very long while, he felt something almost like safety, but deep in his chest. A stir of worry moved soft as an ember, because if danger was coming for him, it might already be coming for them too. The first true break in the weather came 5 days after Jonas woke. Not warmth winter in Silver Butte Valley never surrendered that easily, but a softness in the wind, a pause in the bitter bite of the cold. The kind of day where the sun peeked through thin clouds long enough to remind folks that spring still existed somewhere far beyond the mountains. Inside the Cooper cabin, the fire burned low and steady. Jonas sat near the hearth, wrapped in a blanket, strength returning to him one slow breath at a time. Marion worked at the table behind him, mending a torn sleeve. Eli lay on his stomach in front of the fire, carving a piece of pine into something vaguely horse-shaped. Rosie rocked silently in her little chair, humming tunelessly as she stitched buttons on her doll's crooked dress. For the first time since Jonas had been carried into the cabin half frozen, the room felt less like a sick room and more like a home. As dusk settled, Marion set aside her sewing and poured 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for the man still learning how to hold a cup without flinching from pain. Jonas accepted it with a nod of thanks. His hands shook just slightly, but he hid it well. They sat in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Marian broke it. "You're getting stronger. Strong enough to be honest," Jonas said quietly. She turned to him. Something in his tone, simple, steady, stripped of defenses, made her still. "I owe you the truth," he continued. "Or at least the parts I can bear to speak." Marian didn't interrupt, didn't pry, didn't soften her gaze. She just waited. And sometimes, that was all a man needed to begin. Jonas stared into the fire, as though it held the memories he'd tried to bury. "I had a ranch once," he said. "Good land. Not big, not rich. But mine. Enough cattle to keep us fed. Enough sky to keep a man honest." He paused, swallowing. Then the drought came. 2 years of dust instead of rain. Grass turned brittle. Wells dried up. Cattle died where they stood. I tried to hold on. Sold my horses. Sold tools. Furniture. Everything but my name. Eli stopped carving. Rosie stopped humming. Even the fire seemed to hush itself. Jonas's jaw tightened. In the end, it wasn't enough. The bank took the land. They always do. He rubbed the back of his neck. Voice lower now. "My little brother, Caleb, caught lung fever that same winter. I buried him on land that no longer belonged to me. Never felt right." His breath hitched barely, but Marian heard it. And before all that, he hesitated, fingers tightening around the warm coffee cup. "I was married. Lydia. She was young, hopeful, didn't sign up for ruin. When the ranch went under, she packed her things and left." He didn't spit the words with bitterness. He spoke them with the tired acceptance of a man who'd carried abandonment long enough for it to become familiar. Marian didn't pity him. She simply understood. Jonas drew in a deep breath. "That's my past. Or the bones of it." He didn't mention the other things. The men who'd wronged him. The mistakes he'd made. The accusations that chased him across the frontier. He wasn't ready for that part yet. Marian didn't ask. Instead, she set her cup down and leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting something braver, something more vulnerable. "Since we're being honest," she began, "I should tell you something of my own." Jonas looked up. "I married at 18, she said. "Too young to know better. Too eager to belong somewhere." Her voice softened, but her eyes remained hard. "Tom Cooper was handsome, confident, respected in town. He chose me because I was quiet and obedient. I chose him because I didn't know I was allowed to ask for kindness." Jonas didn't speak. He let her continue. "He ruled everything. What I wore, what I said, how I raised the children. I lived in my own home the way a bird lives in a cage. Pretty from the outside, tight enough to break wings on the inside." A long silence stretched between them. 4 years ago, Marian whispered, "he went riding along the North Ridge. Horse slipped on ice. He fell, broke his neck." Her hands folded slowly in her lap. "That was the first day I breathed, without asking permission." But then her jaw set in a way Jonas recognized all too well. The town didn't see it that way. They still don't. They whispered that I pushed him, or prayed for it, or liked it too much when he died. They decided what I was long before they knew who I am. Jonas stared at her, really stared in a way that made the air between them shift. "I know what it's like," he murmured. "To be judged by folks who only know half a story." Marian nodded once. "And I know what it's like to lose everything that ever felt like yours." They didn't touch. They didn't move closer. They simply sat in the quiet glow of the hearth. Two people shaped by loss and hardened by rumor, recognizing themselves in each other more clearly than either expected. And in that flicker of shared understanding, something warmer than firelight settled between them. Not trust. Not yet. But the beginnings of it, soft as embers, steady as breath, and dangerous in its own quiet way. The blizzard rolled in without warning, one of those sudden, merciless Montana storms that seemed to materialize out of the very breath of the mountains. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of slate, and the wind had begun its long, low howl across the valley. Marian recognized the sound instantly. It was the voice of winter, shifting from patience to fury. She hurried through the cabin, checking shutters, packing more wood near the hearth, urging the children to stay close. Jonas watched from his chair near the fire, jaw tight, sensing the shift in her movements. "What is it?" he asked. "Storm's coming hard," Marian said, "harder than anything this winter's thrown at us." Even before the words left her mouth, the wind slammed against the cabin walls like a fist. A shutter banged violently once, twice, before something tore loose outside with a crack like a rifle shot. Marian moved to the door, but Jonas was already pushing himself up, pain flashing across his face like lightning. "Where do you think you're going?" she demanded. "That shutter's hanging by one hinge," Jonas said. "If it tears off completely, it'll take half your wall with it. You're still healing." She shot back. "Then I'll heal slower," he said, reaching for his coat. "But that wall won't." Marian opened her mouth to argue, but Jonas had already stepped outside into the screaming wind. Eli darted after him before she could stop either of them. The storm hit them like a living thing, cold, so sharp it felt like teeth biting through wool and skin. Jonas gripped the porch rail, forcing himself forward inch by inch. The loose shutter slammed again, flapping violently, threatening to break free and whip into the yard like a blade. Eli shielded the lantern with both hands, trying to keep the flame alive. "I can hold it steady," he shouted, over the roar of the wind. Jonas shook his head. Though he accepted the boy's help, his ribs burned with each breath. But he pressed on. The shutter cracked again, and Jonas lunged, grabbing the wood before the wind could rip it away. "Nails," he shouted. Eli shoved a handful into Jonas's free hand. The man worked by instinct, one hand gripping the shutter, the other hammering with numb fingers. The cold carved into his bones. But he didn't stop. Another gust slammed into the porch, harder than the last. Eli staggered, lantern swinging wildly. Eli Jonas barked. The boy's feet slid across the icy boards. The lantern dropped with a muffled thud. Eli pitched sideways toward the edge of the porch where the ground fell away into the snowdrift below. Marian, watching from the doorway, saw the whole moment in a single, heart-stopping instant. But Jonas was faster than he looked, faster than any man with cracked ribs had a right to be. He dropped the hammer, lunged, and grabbed Eli by the back of his coat, just as the wind tried to yank the boy into the dark. Eli gasped, suspended for a breathless second, feet kicking over nothing. Jonas gritted his teeth, pulling him back inch by brutal inch until Eli crashed into his chest, shaking and breathless but alive. The relief lasted only a moment. Jonas's knees buckled, the pain he'd ignored finally crashing down on him. He slumped to the porch, one hand pressed to his side where fresh blood seeped through the bandages Marian had so carefully tied days earlier. Jonas Marian ran to them, dragging Eli close with one arm while gripping Jonas's coat with the other. "Get up, I've got you." Jonas tried to rise but collapsed again. The storm raged around them, but Marion didn't let go. Somehow, through sheer force of will, she got both her son and this half-broken man back inside. Once the door slammed shut, the cabin suddenly felt too quiet, only the ragged breathing of the three of them filling the space. Marion dropped to her knees beside Jonas, ripping away the wet outer layers of his coat. Blood stained the fresh bandages beneath his shirt. "You reopened the wound," she murmured, voice trembling with fear and fury. "Fool man." Jonas tried to speak, but she pressed a hand gently against his chest. "Don't talk. Just breathe." She cleaned the wound with practiced hands, steady hands, but her eyes shined with something more turbulent. When she spoke again, her voice shook. "You'd die for children you don't even know," she whispered. Jonas met her gaze through the pain. "No child should die alone in the cold," he said. "Not ever." The world seemed to still around the words. Marion swallowed hard, something unspoken moving behind her ribs. When she finished binding him up again, she sat back, breath still unsteady. "You're staying," she said finally. Jonas looked up at her, confused. "Ma'am, through winter," she cut in. "You're staying. And that's final." Jonas didn't argue. Outside, the storm battered the cabin. Inside, the fire glowed warm against the walls, and for the first time, Marion Cooper wasn't sure whether she'd rescued this stranger, or whether, in some small way, he'd begun rescuing her. Winter has its own way of deciding who belongs and who doesn't. Some folks break under the long cold, the endless chores, the quiet that presses too close. Others somehow fit themselves into the rhythm of it, as if they were meant to be there all along. Jonas Hale turned out to be one of the latter. Within a week of the storm, he was moving about the cabin again slowly, carefully, always with a hand on his side, but with a determination that made Marion shake her head more than once. And soon enough, the house that had once echoed with only the voices of Marion and her children felt different, warmer, boozier, more alive. Eli followed Jonas everywhere. Not because he'd been told to, Marion never had to tell that boy twice, but because he wanted to. Jonas had a way of teaching without preaching, showing without talking too much. One morning, as the light crept blue across the snow, Eli stood beside him at the edge of the yard, breath puffing into the cold. "See those prints?" Jonas asked. "That's rabbit. Tight. Close together." He was moving careful. He crouched, tracing the shape in the snow with a gloved finger. "And over here, see the way the snow dips?" Eli nodded eagerly. That's where he stopped to listen for danger. When animals slow down, they leave you clues. You just have to pay attention. Eli repeated the words softly, committing every one to memory. By midday, Jonas was teaching him knots, real knots, the kind that saved lives when the wind snapped a rope or a horse spooked in the wrong moment. "A bad knot will betray you," Jonas said, "and a good one will hold when everything else lets go." People aren't much different. Eli looked up at him then, eyes wide, like those were the truest words he'd heard in his 12 years. Inside, Rosie watched from the window with the shy curiosity of a child who has known more loss than she understands. One afternoon, she approached Jonas, holding a scrap of paper, a shaky drawing of a tiny horse with a crooked mane. "Can you make this?" she asked. Jonas studied the drawing. Then the little girl. "I can try." he said with a soft smile. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, he sat by the lantern carving a block of pine into shape. The blade scraped quietly, sending curls of wood drifting to the table like pale feathers. Jonas worked slow, steady, careful, crafting something more precious than he would ever admit. Marian saw him there when she rose in the night to check the fire. The lantern light cast a warm glow on his face, and something about the stillness of the moment, the gentleness in those hardened hands, stirred something deep inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. By morning, the little wooden horse was finished, simple, sturdy, its legs smooth, its head slightly bowed, as though it understood the world already. Rosie held it to her chest as though it were made of gold. She didn't let go of it for the rest of the day. Marian watched her daughter laugh, truly laugh, for the first time in months. And for a moment, Marian forgot how much she'd been trying to protect her heart from hoping again. Life settled into a rhythm after that, one so natural it almost scared her. Jonas fed the livestock before dawn. Marian cooked breakfast while Rosie braided her doll's hair and Eli practiced knots near the fire. In the evenings, they all gathered around the hearth like the pieces of a puzzle that had somehow been scattered for years and finally found their way back together. One evening, while Rosie played and Eli dozed by the fire, Marian brought Jonas a shirt she'd mended for him. The stitching was neat. Careful, Marian had always been good with her hands. This was torn along the seam. She said, "Should hold better now." Jonas took the shirt, fingers brushing hers. It was nothing. A simple touch. Accidental. But it lingered just long enough for both of them to feel it. Marian's breath hitched. Jonas's eyes lifted to hers. A quiet question flickering between them. Not desire, not yet, but a kind of recognition. A warmth neither of them had asked for, nor expected to find. Marian stepped back first, clearing her throat. "It's late. You should rest." Jonas nodded, folding the shirt with slow, deliberate care. "Thank you. For this, and for everything else." She didn't respond, but something in her eyes softened just a notch. Just enough for a man like Jonas Hale to notice. Outside, the winter wind howled softly against the cabin walls. But inside, something warmer took root. Not love. Not yet. But the shape of it, the shadow of it. A feeling beginning to grow, the way a seed pushes up through cold earth, quiet, steady, unstoppable. And though neither said it aloud, both felt the same truth rising. This house didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like a beginning. By late January, the storm had loosened its grip on the valley. The air was still sharp enough to sting the lungs. But sunlight finally broke through the clouds in pale gold streaks. The kind of day that made a person feel, just for a moment, like winter might not last forever. Jonas was outside, splitting kindling slowly, carefully, with the measured rhythm of a man who still carried pain in his ribs but refused to let it stop him. Marian watched from the porch, arms crossed loosely, not guarding herself like before, but not fully relaxed either. It had become her habit to notice him when she wasn't meaning to. Eli was practicing knots beside him. Rosie trotted about with her wooden horse, humming under her breath, the tiny toy bouncing with each step. It might have been an ordinary afternoon, quiet and tender in its own simple way, if not for the distant thud of approaching hoofbeats. Marian tensed immediately. Jonas straightened, one hand going instinctively to his side, as though bracing himself for something he already recognized. A single rider crested the ridge, Silas Braddock, the wealthy land officer, the man whose name sat at the top of Marion's ledger, the one neighbor everyone pretended to like and secretly feared. He wore a long, dark coat too fine for this part of Montana. And his smile, if you could call it that, was the kind men used when they wanted to remind others how much authority they held. He reined in his tall bay horse right at the foot of the porch. "Well now," Silas drawled, tipping his hat with just enough courtesy to make the disrespect sharper. "Afternoon, Mrs. Cooper. Fine day for visitors." His eyes flicked toward Jonas, measuring him, evaluating him, dismissing him all in a single glance. Marion stepped forward, chin lifted. "What do you want?" "Silas." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, pressing it into her hand with a showman's flourish. "A reminder. Your mortgage is past due. You have tapped the page 30 days to settle up. After that, the county reclaims the property." Marion kept her face still, though Jonas could see the tension in her jaw. "You said spring," she murmured. "Spring changed." Silas replied lightly. "Weather does that. So do debts." Eli stood close to Jonas now, instinctively sensing the shift. Rosie shrank behind Marion's skirt, clutching her wooden horse to her chest. Silas leaned slightly forward in the saddle, lowering his voice to something sly. "Of course, if you've found alternate means of support, perhaps we could discuss an extension." His gaze slid toward Jonas with oily insinuation. Marion's eyes hardened. "Jonas is a guest, nothing more." Silas chuckled. "A guest, my. How generous you've become." "Marion, some folks might wonder what business a widow has taking in a drifter." His smile sharpened. "What reputation she's hoping to keep." Before Marion could speak, Jonas stepped forward. "That's enough." Silas arched a brow, amused. "And the drifter speaks." He let out a laugh, cold and hollow. "A drifter defending a widow, that's rich." Jonas didn't rise to the bait. His voice remained calm, steady, like the kind of man Silas couldn't understand, much less intimidate. "You've said your piece. Now leave." Silas' expression flickered. For a flash of a moment, there was something ugly there, something used to being obeyed, not challenged. He collected himself with a thin smile. 30 days. "Mrs. Cooper," he said, turning his horse. "I'm not a patient man, and winter isn't kind to those who waste time." He kicked his horse into a trot and rode off, leaving a trail of churned snow behind him. Only after he disappeared did the breath Marion had been holding finally escape her. She looked down at the paper in her hands, its edges fluttering in the wind. Jonas watched her, watched the weight settle over her shoulders again, the weight she'd carried long before he arrived. "He can't take this place," Jonas said quietly. Marion's eyes lifted to his, dark with determination and something more fragile beneath it. "He will," she whispered. "If I don't find a way to stop him." Jonas didn't touch her, didn't move closer, but the promise was already forming between them unspoken. Strong as a winter vow, he would not let her fight this alone. Sunday arrived clear and bitter, the kind of morning where the cold clings to church bells and turns every footstep brittle. Marion dressed the children in their best, Eli in his patched Sunday coat, Rosie in the little blue dress she'd outgrown but still insisted on wearing, and they rode the wagon to town. Jonas stayed behind, knowing full well that his presence beside a widow would ignite more than whispers. He didn't want to make things harder, not for her, not for the children, But the whispers came anyway. From the moment Marian stepped through the church doors, a hush rippled through the pews. Eyes darted, chin lifted, fan snapped shut. The reverend's wife leaned toward another lady and murmured something sharp behind a gloved hand. Marian didn't have to hear the words to know what they were. Taking in a man, setting a poor example, inviting sin into her home. Rosie shrank closer to Marian's side. Eli kept his eyes forward, jaw tight with the stubborn pride of a boy trying to grow up too fast. Jonas stayed behind, knowing full well that his presence beside a widow would ignite more than whispers. He didn't want to make things harder. Not for her. Not for the children. The sermon that morning was pointed. The Reverend spoke of temptation, of impropriety, of widows who must guard their reputation lest they lead others astray. The message slid through the room like a cold draft. Meant for one woman and one woman only. After the service, the congregation spilled into the yard, each cluster of townsfolk buzzing with quiet speculation. Marian tried to guide her children toward the wagon, but the snickers and smirks followed her like shadows. Then it happened. By the hitching post, 3 boys stood in a circle around Eli, one of them the blacksmith's son. Broad-shouldered and smug stepped forward. He spat into the dirt and sneered. "How's it feel having a mama who keeps a man warm in her house?" Eli didn't flinch, didn't speak, didn't look away. The boy pushed again, meaner this time. "Guess your ma needed someone round since your pa's gone. Not real respectable, is it?" Rosie cried out. But Eli's fist flew before she could reach him. The boys tumbled into the mud, arms swinging, boots kicking. Eli fighting with all the rage and humiliation he'd swallowed the entire morning. The crowd gasped. Someone shouted. And that was when Jonas appeared, having ridden into town quietly to buy nails. But arriving just in time to see Eli slam into the dirt. He moved fast. Jonas pulled Eli out of the scuffle, holding the boy's shoulders, grounding him with a steadiness that cut through the chaos. "Easy, son. Enough." Eli trembled with fury. He called Mama. "I know," Jonas murmured. "But this isn't the way." The blacksmith's son scrambled back, wide-eyed now that the drifter stood before him. Jonas didn't threaten him, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the boy long enough for the truth to sink in. Then he guided Eli toward the wagon where Marian waited, pale with equal parts fear and heartbreak. As Jonas helped Eli climb aboard, Marian lowered her gaze, overwhelmed by the crushing weight of it all. Braddock's threats, the town's judgment, debts she never created, and now her children suffering for sins she didn't commit. She felt trapped, cornered by forces she couldn't outrun. And as the wagon rolled away, Jonas walked alongside for a few steps, quietly matching their pace. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Marian already knew. The town might turn against her. The debts might rise like winter storms. But Jonas Hale, he wasn't going anywhere. The town hall was packed tighter than a cattle car. Word had spread fast. Silas Braddock had urgent concerns to raise about a certain drifter living under a widow's roof. Folks showed up hungry for spectacle, eager to pass judgment on someone not seated in their own pew. Jonas stood near the back, arms folded, face calm but eyes alert. Marian arrived a moment later with Eli and Rosie beside her. And though she tried to hide it, Jonas saw the fear flicker in her expression. She didn't like crowds. She liked crowds even less when they gathered with rumors in their pockets. Braddock stepped up to the front with the swagger of a man who believed every room belonged to him. He cleared his throat, drawing every eye. "People of Silver Butte," he began. I bring you troubling news, a matter concerning the safety and decency of our community. He paused, letting the silence stretch. It's about the man staying at Mrs. Cooper's home. Murmurs rippled through the hall. Braddock pointed at Jonas like he was pointing out a rattlesnake coiled under the rafters. This man is not who he claims. He is a deserter. He abandoned his cavalry unit during the Indian Wars, left his fellow soldiers good men to die while he ran. Gasps. A few curses. A woman clutched her shawl tight around her throat. Jonas didn't move. He looked at Braddock with the same steady gaze he'd given a hungry wolf. But the room shifted. Every whisper was a stone thrown. Every glance was a verdict handed down by people who only knew the version Braddock fed them. It's not true. Jonas said, voice level? I left my post because my brother was dying. Came back 2 days later. Unit was gone. War was changing. Men were scattered. Someone stamped the word deserter on my name because it was easier than listening. Braddock laughed. A convenient story for a man with no witnesses. Jonas started to speak again. But the crowd had already turned. Once doubt grips a room, truth rarely gets a fair trial. Someone shouted. We don't want trouble here, another snapped. We don't need drifters bringing danger. Jonas looked toward Marion. Just one look. One silent plea for something, anything, to show she believed him. But Marion froze. Fear pinned her in place. Not fear of Jonas, but fear of the crowd. Fear of Braddock. Fear of losing everything she had worked so hard to protect. Her hands trembled. Her lips parted. But no words came. That silence hit Jonas harder than any accusation. He lowered his eyes, nodded once, a small, almost invisible bow of resignation. That night, he packed quietly in the barn. No speeches. No anger. Just a man who had spent too many years learning what it felt like to be unwanted. Eli burst in first. You can't go. You promised you'd teach me to track spring deer. You said. Jonas knelt, pulling Eli into a tight, painful embrace. You'll track just fine without me. Son. Rosie stood behind her brother, clutching her wooden horse, tears streaking her cheeks. Please don't leave. Jonas. Mama needs you. We need you. His voice cracked for the first time. I know. Little one? But some storms, a man's got to ride through alone. He mounted his horse, ribs aching, heart heavier than the saddle beneath him. Marion stood on the porch, hands clasped, torn between guilt and terror, wanting to call out, but unable to open her mouth. Jonas didn't look back. He rode into the freezing dark, the snow swallowing the sound of hooves, leaving behind a home that had almost let him belong again. Jonas rode into the night with nothing but a fevered determination beating inside him. Snow lashed at his face, the cold slicing through his coat, but he kept going down the valley, across the frozen flats, toward the county seat, 20 miles east. A man running away moved differently than a man riding toward something. Jonas was doing the latter. Every hoofbeat echoed the same promise: she won't lose that land. Not because of me. Not because of him. By dawn. He stood pounding on the county clerk's door, breath rising in white clouds. The clerk opened it half asleep, robe trailing. But Jonas didn't apologize. He simply said, I need to see the Brennan loan records. All of them. Something in his voice said refusing wasn't an option. For hours, Jonas combed through ledgers and aging papers until he found what he was looking for: dusty documents stamped paid in full, bearing Thomas Cooper's true signature, not the forged one Braddock had waved in Marion's face. Jonas obtained certified copies, folded them into his coat, and mounted up again as the sun rose orange behind him. He rode home fast, hard, purpose driving him faster than pain could slow. By late morning, Marion stood on the porch, hands wringing, guilt clinging to her like the last cold of winter. When she saw the distant rider crest the hill, she froze. Then, as Jonas drew closer, her face broke not into a smile, not yet, but into something rawer hope, fear, relief, all tangled together. Jonas swung off the horse, breath heavy. He lied. He said simply, "And I have proof." Marion took the papers with hands that trembled. Her knees nearly buckled when she saw the signatures. "Jonas, how did you—" "It doesn't matter," he said. "We're ending this." Today, the courthouse filled again. The same faces that had condemned Jonas 2 nights before. But this time, Jonas didn't stand at the back. He walked straight to the front, placing the documents on the table in front of Silas Braddock, whose smug expression faltered for the first time. "These," Jonas said, voice steady as a winter horizon, "are the real loan papers. Thomas Cooper paid his mortgage years ago." The sheriff leaned over the documents, comparing signatures Braddock's forged. Shaky imitations against the strong, confident strokes of the man long dead. The difference was plain as day. Braddock sputtered. This is nonsense." "He's lying." Jonas didn't flinch. "I've been called worse by better men." Whispers spread like wildfire. The sheriff straightened. "Yav set, Silas Braddock," he said. "You're under arrest for fraud and attempted theft." Gasps shattered the room. Braddock reached for his pistol out of reflex, but the deputies were faster. They dragged him from the hall as he shouted curses that no one cared to hear anymore. For the first time, silence filled the room, not of judgment, but of shame and reconsideration. And then Marion stepped forward. Her voice did not shake. "This man," she said, looking at Jonas, "saved my children. He saved me. And he told the truth when the rest of us were too afraid to speak." One by one, faces around the room shifted. Some lowered their eyes. Some nodded slowly. And some, for the first time, saw Jonas Hale for who he truly was. Not a drifter, not a deserter, but a man of honor. Spring approached quietly, melting the last of the frost. Jonas repaired the fence's stubborn boards that winter had bent, and Eli worked at his side, determined to match every swing of the hammer. Rosie's little garden sprouted green shoots, each one tended with the careful hope only a child carries. Marion watched all of it with a warmth she no longer tried to hide. One evening, as the sun burned low behind the mountains, Jonas stood with her on the porch. In his hand rested a ring carved from oak, polished smooth, simple as the man who made it. "It's not much," he said, voice soft, "but it's made with honest hands, like everything worth keeping." Marion looked at the ring, then at him. "Jonas Hale, stay." Not as a stranger. Her voice trembled with something beautiful. As family, the 2 children cheered behind them. The light from the cabin spilled warm across the steps. And Jonas, for the first time in years, felt the weight he'd carried finally slip from his shoulders. The 4 of them stood together as the sun dipped behind the ridge door open. Fire glowing, home alive. The winter had taken so much, but it had given them something greater, a beginning. And now, dear listeners, if this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Tell me your thoughts, your favorite moment, or just say hello in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Western Tales, where love, courage, and frontier hope live on in every story. I'll see you in the next one.